The year was 1880, and the grand ballroom of the Royal Hotel in Folkestone buzzed with the refined chatter of Victorian society's elite. Among the swirling silk gowns and tailored evening coats, one figure commanded attention like a magnet draws iron. Florence Elizabeth Chandler, an 18-year-old American beauty, whose luminous presence seemed to illuminate the very air around her. Her auburn hair caught the gaslight in waves of fire, her porcelain complexion unmarred by the harsh realities that would soon define her life, and her eyes sparkled with the confidence that only youth and privilege could bestow. She had arrived in England just months earlier, the daughter of a respected Alabama banker, seeking the cultural refinement that Europe promised young American ladies of breeding. What Florence couldn't have known, as she glided across that polished floor in her Worth gown, was that fate had already chosen her dance partner for the evening, and for a tragedy that would echo through history. James Maybrick stood 41 years old that night, a man whose wealth from the Liverpool cotton trade afforded him the finest of everything Victorian England could offer. His dark hair was already touched with silver at the temples, lending him an air of distinguished maturity that younger women found irresistibly attractive. To Florence's inexperienced eyes, he appeared the very embodiment of worldly sophistication, a successful merchant prince who moved through society with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Their introduction came through mutual acquaintances, as such things did in proper society, but the spark between them ignited with an intensity that shocked even the most romantic observers. James, who had lived the life of a confirmed bachelor, suddenly found himself utterly captivated by this spirited American girl who spoke with charming directness and laughed with uninhibited joy. Florence, raised in the warm embrace of Southern hospitality, was dazzled by James's tales of international commerce and his promises to show her the grandest sights of Europe. The courtship that followed unfolded like a fairy tale scripted by the most optimistic of novelists. James showered Florence with gifts that spoke of both his wealth and his infatuation. Sapphires that matched her eyes, roses shipped from the finest gardens of France, and handwritten poetry that revealed surprising depths beneath his businessman's exterior. He whisked her away on romantic sojourns to Paris, where they walked hand in hand along the Seine, and to the Swiss Alps, where she laughed with delight at her first sight of snow-capped peaks. For Florence, those months represented everything she had dreamed of when she first stepped aboard the steamship bound for Europe. Here was adventure, romance, and a future that promised comfort and security beyond her wildest American dreams. James spoke of their life together in terms that painted pictures of endless happiness. A grand house in Liverpool where she would reign as mistress, summers spent traveling the continent, winters warming themselves by fires in drawing rooms filled with the finest literature and most stimulating conversation. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The wedding took place on July 27, 1881, in the picturesque Church of St. James in Piccadilly, London. Florence, radiant in ivory silk and Belgian lace, looked every inch the blushing bride as she pledged her life to the man who had swept her off her feet. The ceremony was attended by the cream of Anglo-American society, a testament to James's social standing and Florence's own considerable charm. Newspaper society columns would later describe it as the wedding of the season, a perfect union between New World vivacity and Old World refinement. As rice showered down upon the newlyweds outside the church steps, neither bride nor groom could have imagined the darkness that lay waiting in their future. James's warm smile masked secrets that would poison their marriage from within, while Florence's trusting nature would soon encounter the harsh realities of Victorian society's expectations for wives. The fairy tale was complete, the stage was set, but the real story, the one that would end in death, scandal, and a courtroom drama that would captivate two nations, was only just beginning to unfold. That night, as they departed for their honeymoon in the Lake District, Florence Chandler had become Florence Maybrick, and with that transformation, she had unknowingly stepped into a web of deception and tragedy that would ultimately threaten to destroy everything she held dear. The honeymoon bliss evaporated like morning mist the moment Florence crossed the threshold of Battlecrease House in Aigburth, Liverpool. The imposing Victorian mansion that James had described in such glowing terms stood before her like a monument to masculine authority. Dark brick walls rising 3 stories high, windows that seemed to watch her with cold disapproval, and an atmosphere of established routine that had no place for a young American bride's modern sensibilities. From the very first day, Florence discovered that her new home operated according to rules she had never been taught to follow. The servants, led by the formidable housekeeper Mrs. Briggs, treated her with barely concealed disdain, their loyalty firmly anchored to their long-established master rather than his foreign wife. They whispered in corridors when she passed, their conversations falling silent the moment she appeared, creating an environment of constant surveillance that made her feel like an intruder in what should have been her own domain. But it was James himself who presented the most bewildering transformation. The charming suitor who had wooed her with poetry and passion revealed himself to be a man of rigid habits and peculiar obsessions that he had carefully concealed during their courtship. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, he would disappear into his study for what he called his constitutional, a ritual that Florence initially assumed involved correspondence or business matters, but which she would later discover served a far more sinister purpose. The truth about James Maybrick's morning ritual emerged gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, revealing details that grew more disturbing with each passing week. Hidden within the locked drawers of his desk lay an extensive collection of small bottles and packets, each containing substances that would have alarmed any reasonable person. James, Florence learned with growing horror, had been consuming arsenic regularly for years, convinced that it served as both a tonic for his health and an aphrodisiac for his legendary appetite for physical pleasure. This wasn't mere experimentation or occasional indulgence. James Maybrick was systematically poisoning himself with a daily cocktail of arsenic, strychnine, and morphine that he believed kept him vigorous and youthful. He would measure out precise doses with the care of a pharmacist, mixing the deadly powders into his morning coffee or evening brandy as casually as another man might add sugar. When Florence expressed her shock and concern, James dismissed her fears with the patronizing tone of a man addressing a child who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of masculine health maintenance. The discovery of her husband's drug habits proved to be only the first crack in the facade of their perfect marriage. As weeks turned to months, Florence began to notice other troubling patterns in James's behavior. He would disappear for entire evenings without explanation, returning home with the satisfied air of a man who had been well entertained elsewhere. When she questioned these absences, James would fly into rages that revealed a temper as volatile as the chemicals he consumed, accusing her of being a nagging American wife who failed to understand English customs regarding a gentleman's freedoms. The isolation that had begun with the servants' coldness now extended to Liverpool society itself. The wealthy merchants' wives who should have welcomed Florence into their circle instead viewed her with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Her American mannerisms, which James had once found charming, were now seen as evidence of her fundamental unsuitability for proper English society. She spoke too freely, laughed too loudly, and expressed opinions too boldly for a culture that expected wives to remain decoratively silent in the shadows of their husbands' accomplishments. As 1882 dawned, Florence found herself pregnant with their first child, a development that should have brought joy but instead highlighted the growing chasm in their relationship. James's reaction to the news was decidedly lukewarm, his attention remaining focused on his business ventures and his mysterious evening entertainments. During her pregnancy, Florence discovered that her husband's absences followed a pattern that led inevitably to a specific address in Liverpool, a modest house where lived a woman named Sarah Robertson, who had been James's mistress for over a decade. The revelation struck Florence like a physical blow. Not only had James been maintaining this relationship throughout their entire marriage, but Sarah Robertson had borne him 5 children, 5 half-siblings to the baby Florence carried. The man who had promised her eternal devotion and exclusive affection had simply added her to his collection of women, expecting her to accept her role as the official wife, while he continued his established patterns of infidelity and deception. The birth of their son James in March 1882 brought temporary hope that parenthood might reform her husband's character, but those hopes proved as fragile as spun glass. Within weeks of the child's arrival, James had returned to his old habits with renewed vigor, leaving Florence to navigate the challenges of new motherhood while managing a household that seemed determined to undermine her at every turn. By the winter of 1887, Florence Maybrick had transformed from the radiant bride of Battlecrease House into a woman whose spirit bore the invisible scars of 6 years spent in emotional exile. The birth of their daughter Gladys in 1886 had brought her moments of pure joy, but even motherhood couldn't shield her from the crushing reality that her marriage had become a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maintain appearances while slowly destroying her from within. The final, devastating confirmation of James's betrayal came not through whispered gossip or suspicious behavior, but through a chance encounter that would forever alter the trajectory of Florence's life. Walking through Liverpool's fashionable district one crisp December afternoon, she stumbled upon a scene that crystallized years of suspicion into undeniable truth. There, emerging from an expensive millinery shop with packages that suggested intimate gift-giving, was James himself, but he wasn't alone. The woman on his arm possessed a mature beauty that spoke of years spent being cherished and provided for, and the easy familiarity between them told a story that no amount of denial could erase. Sarah Robertson, Florence realized with sick certainty, wasn't merely her husband's mistress, she was his other wife in everything but law. The way James guided her carefully around puddles, the protective gesture of his hand at her elbow, the genuine smile that played at his lips as he listened to her conversation. These were the attentions Florence had yearned for throughout their entire marriage, freely given to another woman who had never pledged her life to him before God and society. That evening, when James returned home with his usual air of casual indifference, Florence confronted him with a directness that would have scandalized proper Victorian wives, but felt like the only honest response to years of deception. The argument that followed shattered whatever remained of their marital pretense, with James making no attempt to deny the relationship, but instead defending it with the cold logic of a man who believed his wealth entitled him to whatever pleasures he desired. "You have your position as my wife," he told her with brutal honesty. "Sarah has my affection. Consider yourself fortunate that society requires me to maintain your respectability, because without that protection, you would have nothing at all." The words struck Florence like physical blows, but they also accomplished something James hadn't intended. They freed her from whatever remaining loyalty she might have felt toward a man who viewed her as nothing more than a decorative necessity. If he could maintain a decade-long relationship with another woman while keeping her trapped in a loveless marriage, then perhaps the moral constraints that bound her were simply chains of her own making. It was in this state of emotional devastation and newfound defiance that Florence first encountered Alfred Brearley at a cotton exchange reception in March 1889. Where James had grown cold and dismissive over the years, Alfred radiated warmth and genuine interest. A successful cotton broker in his early 30s, he possessed the kind of easy charm that James had once displayed but had long since abandoned in favor of casual cruelty. More importantly, Alfred looked at Florence and saw not a disappointing acquisition, but a woman of intelligence and beauty who deserved far better than the life fate had handed her. Their initial conversations were innocent enough, discussions of literature, politics, and the changing world beyond Liverpool's insular society. But Alfred's obvious admiration for Florence's quick wit and independent spirit provided a stark contrast to James's habitual dismissal of her thoughts and opinions. For the first time in years, Florence found herself engaged in conversations that stimulated her mind rather than simply enduring lectures about her various shortcomings as a wife. The transformation from intellectual companion to something more dangerous happened gradually, like ice melting in spring sunlight. Alfred began finding reasons to call at Battlecrease House when James was away on business, ostensibly to discuss cotton market fluctuations, but actually to spend precious hours in conversation with a woman whose company had become the highlight of his days. Florence, starved for genuine companionship and emotional connection, found herself anticipating these visits with an excitement she hadn't felt since her courtship days. By early 1889, their relationship had crossed the invisible line that separated friendship from something far more perilous. When Alfred suggested they might spend a few days together in London under the pretense of Florence needing medical consultation for recurring headaches, She agreed with the reckless abandon of a woman who had finally decided to claim some happiness for herself, regardless of the consequences. The London trip in March 1889 represented Florence's first real act of rebellion against the prison her marriage had become. For 3 days, she experienced the kind of attention and affection she had dreamed of during her lonely nights at Battlecrease House. Alfred treated her with the courtesy and genuine care that should have been her husband's domain, making her feel beautiful, intelligent, and worthy of devotion for the first time in years. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, and Florence's brief escape into happiness would soon set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately threaten not just her marriage, but her very life. The spring of 1889 brought an unseasonable chill to Liverpool, but nothing could have prepared the inhabitants of Battlecrease House for the storm that was about to engulf them. James Maybrick returned from his London business trip on April 27th in what appeared to be his usual robust health, showing no signs of the catastrophe that would unfold over the following 2 weeks. He had spent several days negotiating cotton contracts and attending to various financial matters, maintaining the energetic pace that had made him successful in the competitive world of international commerce. Yet within hours of his return, something began to go terribly wrong inside James Maybrick's body. The first symptoms appeared during dinner on April 28th, when he suddenly pushed away his plate of roast beef, claiming that the food tasted peculiar and seemed to burn his throat as he swallowed. Florence, still glowing from her recent London adventure with Alfred Brearley, initially dismissed his complaints as the typical grumbling of a man whose constitution had been weakened by years of self-administered poisons. But as the evening progressed, James's condition deteriorated with alarming rapidity. Violent stomach cramps doubled him over in his chair, followed by waves of nausea that sent him rushing to his chambers. When Florence checked on him later that night, she found him writhing in bed, his face pale and covered with a cold sweat that soaked through his nightshirt. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and his speech had developed a peculiar slurred quality that she had never heard before, even during his heaviest drinking episodes. The next morning brought no relief, only an escalation of symptoms that baffled everyone in the household. James complained of a metallic taste in his mouth that made eating nearly impossible, while his legs had developed a strange weakness that made walking difficult. Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper who had served the family for over a decade, whispered to the other servants that she had never seen the master in such a state, not even during his worst bouts of self-inflicted chemical experimentation. Dr. Richard Humphreys, the family physician who had treated James for years, arrived at Battlecrease House on April 30th to find his patient in a condition that defied easy diagnosis. The symptoms presented a confusing array of possibilities. The stomach pain and vomiting could indicate any number of digestive ailments, while the tremors and weakness suggested possible nervous system involvement. What troubled Dr. Humphreys most was the rapid progression of the illness and the peculiar combination of symptoms that didn't fit any standard pattern he recognized. Florence found herself caught between genuine concern for her husband's well-being and a growing awareness that his illness was creating dangerous scrutiny of the household's routines. The servants, already suspicious of their American mistress, began watching her movements with increased attention. Every meal she supervised, every medicine she administered, every moment she spent in James's sick room became subject to whispered analysis and speculation. As May arrived, James's condition fluctuated wildly from day to day, creating a pattern that would later become crucial evidence in determining what was really happening at Battlecrease House. Some mornings he would appear to be recovering, managing to eat small amounts of food, and even conducting limited business correspondence from his bed. But these periods of improvement were inevitably followed by severe relapses that seemed to coincide with particular meals or medications, creating a cycle of hope and despair that wore down everyone in the household. The mystery deepened when Dr. Humphreys consulted with several colleagues about James's puzzling symptoms. Each physician offered different theories. Some suggested food poisoning from contaminated meat, others proposed a tropical disease contracted during his business travels, and a few wondered if his years of arsenic consumption had finally triggered some kind of systemic breakdown. None of these explanations, however, could account for the specific pattern of James's illness or the way certain symptoms would appear and disappear seemingly at random. Meanwhile, Florence struggled to maintain her composure while managing a household in crisis. Her recent relationship with Alfred Brearley had left her emotionally vulnerable, and the constant stress of James's illness was beginning to show in her own appearance and behavior. She found herself making impulsive decisions that would later be viewed with deep suspicion. Purchasing items from the local chemist, preparing special foods for James's delicate stomach, and spending long hours alone with him in his sick room where no witnesses could observe their interactions. The servants noticed everything. They saw how Florence's hands sometimes shook when she carried James's medicine upstairs. They observed the way she would stand at his bedside for long minutes, watching him with an expression that could be interpreted as either concern or calculation. Most significantly, they began to document the timing of James's worst episodes, creating an informal record that would later prove devastatingly important. By May 8th, it had become clear that whatever was affecting James Maybrick was beyond the scope of ordinary illness. His body was systematically shutting down, organ by organ, in a progression that suggested something far more sinister than natural disease. The question that began to whisper through Battlecrease House wasn't whether James would recover, but whether his illness was truly the result of accident or misfortune, or something far more deliberate and deadly. The morning of May 9th, 1889, dawned gray and oppressive over Liverpool, as if the very sky reflected the mounting tension within Battlecrease House. While James Maybrick lay writhing in his sickbed, consumed by the mysterious illness that had gripped him for nearly 2 weeks, his wife Florence made a decision that would ultimately seal her fate in the eyes of Victorian justice. She walked into Hanson's chemist shop on Igbeth Road with a specific and highly unusual request that would echo through courtrooms and newspaper headlines for decades to come. "I require 24 sheets of Tanglefoot flypaper," Florence told the young clerk with what witnesses would later describe as nervous determination. When pressed about the unusually large quantity, she explained that Battlecrease House was plagued by an exceptional infestation of flies that threatened both sanitation and her husband's recovery. The clerk, Edwin Heaton, later recalled that Mrs. Maybrick seemed agitated and avoided direct eye contact while making her purchase, behavior that struck him as odd for a woman typically known for her confident American directness. What Edwin Heaton couldn't have known as he wrapped the innocent-looking flypapers was that each sheet contained a substantial amount of arsenic, the very poison that would soon become central to one of the century's most controversial murder trials. The papers themselves were a common household item, designed to attract and kill flies with their arsenic-impregnated surface, but their potential for far more sinister purposes was well understood by anyone with basic knowledge of chemistry. Florence returned to Battlecrease House carrying her deadly purchase, unaware that her transaction had already begun to generate the kind of gossip that would prove fatal to her reputation. Victorian Liverpool was a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the sight of the young American wife purchasing such an unusual quantity of poison-laced flypapers during her husband's mysterious illness was exactly the kind of detail that set tongues wagging in parlors across the city. That same afternoon, while James dozed fitfully in his sick room, Florence retired to her private chambers to begin the process that would either save her husband's life or damn her own soul to history's judgment. Behind locked doors, she carefully soaked the flypapers in basins of warm water, watching as the arsenic slowly dissolved into a clear, odorless solution that could be easily administered without detection. The process required patience and precision. Too little soaking would fail to extract sufficient poison, while too much might create a concentration that would kill immediately rather than gradually. Florence had learned about arsenic extraction from sources that would never be definitively established, though prosecutors would later suggest she had researched the method deliberately and with murderous intent. Some historians believe she may have simply been following folk remedies passed down through generations of women who used arsenic solutions as cosmetic treatments, a practice that was surprisingly common among Victorian ladies seeking to maintain their complexions. Others argue that her knowledge demonstrated premeditated murder of the most calculating kind. As she worked, Florence could hear the sounds of James's suffering through the walls, his groans of pain, his calls for water, his delirious mutterings about business deals and mysterious enemies who might be trying to destroy him. Whether these sounds filled her with compassion or determination remains one of the great unknowns of the case, a question that would torment judges, juries, and historians for generations to come. The arsenic solution, once properly prepared, resembled nothing more than ordinary water, making it the perfect vehicle for clandestine poisoning. Florence transferred the liquid into a small medicine bottle that she labeled as a digestive tonic, one of dozens of remedies that had accumulated in James's sick room as various doctors attempted to treat his mysterious ailment. In the chaos of his illness, with multiple physicians prescribing different treatments and the household staff struggling to keep track of various medications, one additional bottle would attract no particular attention. But Florence had not counted on the vigilance of Alice Yap, the children's nursemaid, whose loyalty to the Maybrick family predated Florence's arrival by several years. Yap had been watching her mistress with growing suspicion ever since James's illness began, noting inconsistencies in Florence's behavior and observing the peculiar timing of his worst episodes. When she discovered damp flypapers hidden in Florence's room, her suspicions crystallized into certainty that something terrible was happening under the roof of Battlecrease House. The confrontation between mistress and servant occurred on the evening of May 10th, when Yap boldly entered Florence's chambers without permission and discovered evidence that she immediately recognized as incriminating. The remaining flypapers, still damp from their arsenic extraction, lay partially concealed beneath Florence's dressing table, while the telltale basins and medicine bottles completed a picture that even the most charitable observer would find difficult to explain innocently. "What have you done?" Yap demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and moral outrage that would soon spread throughout the household like wildfire. Florence's response, or lack thereof, would become another piece of the circumstantial evidence that prosecutors would use to build their case for deliberate murder. The morning of May 11th, 1889, arrived at Battlecrease House with an ominous stillness that seemed to press against the windows like an unwelcome visitor. James Maybrick lay in his bed, his once robust frame now reduced to a shadow of its former self, his breathing shallow and labored as his body fought a losing battle against the poison coursing through his veins. The man who had once commanded cotton markets and dominated drawing rooms with his forceful personality was now barely conscious, his glazed eyes staring at the ceiling with the distant expression of someone already halfway to another world. Florence sat beside his bed in the pre-dawn darkness, her vigil having stretched through the night as she watched her husband's condition deteriorate with each passing hour. Whether her presence at his bedside represented the devoted care of a loving wife or the calculating observation of a murderer completing her work would become a question that haunted courtrooms and divided public opinion for decades to come. Her face, illuminated only by the flickering gaslight, revealed nothing of her inner thoughts as she witnessed the final stages of James's mysterious illness. At precisely 8:37 in the morning, James Maybrick drew his last breath with a rattling exhale that seemed to echo through the silent house like a death knell. Florence remained motionless for several minutes, watching the stillness that had replaced his labored breathing, before finally reaching out to close his eyes with a gesture that observers would later interpret as either tender farewell or cold satisfaction. The Cotton King of Liverpool was dead at age 50, leaving behind a fortune, a mystery, and a wife whose future now hung in the balance. The news of James's death spread through the household with supernatural speed, carried by servants who had been anticipating this moment for days. Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper whose loyalty to James had never wavered, immediately took charge of the practical arrangements while casting suspicious glances at Florence that spoke volumes about her private thoughts. The other staff members gathered in hushed clusters, their whispered conversations creating an atmosphere of accusation that would soon envelope Florence like a suffocating shroud. But it was the arrival of James's brothers, Michael and Edwin Maybrick, that transformed the house of mourning into something resembling an armed camp. The two men, both successful in their own right and fiercely protective of the family name, had never fully accepted their brother's American wife, viewing her as an outsider whose foreign ways had corrupted their traditionally English household. Now, faced with James's sudden death and armed with servants' gossip about flypapers and suspicious behavior, they arrived at Battlecrease House with the conviction that they were confronting a murderer. Michael Maybrick, a celebrated composer and performer who had achieved fame throughout the British Empire, possessed the kind of commanding presence that could dominate any room he entered. When he swept into the house that afternoon, his grief was immediately channeled into righteous anger as he surveyed what he perceived as evidence of his brother's murder. Edwin, quieter but equally determined, began methodically searching through James's papers and possessions, looking for clues that might explain the mysterious circumstances of his death. The confrontation that followed would be remembered by everyone present as the moment when suspicion crystallized into open accusation. Standing in the very room where James's body lay cooling, Michael Maybrick faced Florence with the accumulated fury of months of suppressed doubts and family loyalty. His voice, trained by years of public performance, filled the space with accusations that reverberated like thunder through the house. "You killed him," he declared with the absolute certainty of a man whose world had been shattered by betrayal. "My brother lies dead, and you stand there with the guilt written across your face like scarlet letters." The melodramatic language reflected not just his professional background, but also the genuine anguish of a man who believed he was confronting his brother's murderer in the very room where the crime had been committed. Florence's response to these accusations would become one of the most analyzed moments in the entire case. Instead of the heated denials or emotional breakdown that might be expected from an innocent woman falsely accused, she maintained an almost supernatural composure that her accusers interpreted as evidence of calculated guilt. Her calm assertion that James had died from natural causes, possibly complicated by his years of arsenic consumption, fell on ears already convinced of her culpability. Within hours of James's death, the Maybrick brothers had effectively seized control of Battlecrease House and begun treating Florence as a prisoner in her own home. They confiscated her personal belongings, restricted her movements, and began interrogating servants about every detail of her behavior during James's illness. The transformation was swift and brutal. The woman who had awakened that morning as the mistress of a grand estate found herself by evening under virtual house arrest, surrounded by people who viewed her as a dangerous criminal awaiting justice. The local authorities, summoned by the Maybrick brothers' urgent demands for investigation, arrived to find a situation that seemed to confirm every suspicion. The discovery of the flypapers, the servants' testimonies about Florence's suspicious behavior, and the convenient timing of James's death during her husband's most vulnerable period created a circumstantial case that appeared overwhelmingly convincing to Victorian minds already predisposed to suspect the worst of foreign wives who had married above their station. The summer of 1889 transformed St. George's Hall in Liverpool into the epicenter of a legal and social earthquake that would reverberate across two continents. The imposing neoclassical building, with its massive columns and soaring dome, had witnessed countless trials throughout its history, but none had generated the extraordinary public fascination that surrounded the case of Florence Elizabeth Maybrick. From the moment the proceedings began on July 31st, every seat in the vast courtroom was filled with spectators who had traveled from across Britain and America to witness what newspapers were already calling the trial of the century. Mr. Justice Stephen, the presiding judge whose reputation for stern moral authority preceded him into the courtroom, surveyed the packed galleries with the grim satisfaction of a man who understood the historical significance of the proceedings he was about to oversee. At 70 years of age, James Fitzjames Stephen represented the absolute pinnacle of Victorian judicial authority, a legal mind that had shaped English jurisprudence for decades, and whose very presence seemed to embody the moral certainty of an empire at its peak. Florence entered the dock wearing black silk that emphasized both her widow's status and her pale beauty, creating an image that would be sketched by courtroom artists and reproduced in newspapers around the world. The months since James's death had taken their toll. Her face had grown thinner, her eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear, but she maintained the composed dignity that had characterized her throughout the investigation. To some observers, her demeanor suggested innocence under siege. To others, it revealed the calculated composure of a woman who had committed the perfect crime. The prosecution, led by Mr. Addison with the assistance of several of Liverpool's most formidable legal minds, opened their case with a methodical presentation of evidence that painted Florence as a cold-blooded poisoner who had murdered her husband for freedom and financial gain. Their strategy was devastatingly simple. Present the jury with a timeline that connected Florence's purchase of flypapers directly to James's death, while emphasizing the moral failings that they argued had motivated her to commit murder. Members of the jury, Addison began in his opening statement, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the packed courtroom. You will hear evidence that the prisoner, dissatisfied with the bonds of matrimony and corrupted by adulterous passion, deliberately and systematically poisoned her husband with arsenic extracted from flypapers purchased for that specific purpose. This is not a case of sudden violence or passionate crime, but rather the calculated murder of a trusting husband by a wife who had abandoned all moral restraint. The prosecution's case unfolded with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, each witness adding another piece to what they portrayed as an irrefutable puzzle of guilt. Edwin Heaton, the chemist's clerk, testified about Florence's nervous demeanor when purchasing the unusually large quantity of flypapers. His testimony delivered with the confident clarity of a man who believed he was helping to convict a dangerous criminal. Alice Yap, the nursemaid whose discovery of the damp flypapers had triggered the investigation, painted a picture of a household where the mistress had behaved with suspicious secrecy throughout her husband's final illness. The medical evidence presented particular challenges for both sides, as the science of toxicology in 1889 was still developing and arsenic detection remained more art than exact science. Dr. Littlejohn, the prosecution's expert witness, testified that he had found traces of arsenic in James's body that exceeded what could be explained by his habitual consumption of the poison as a supposed tonic. However, the defense would later challenge both the accuracy of his methods and the interpretation of his findings, creating reasonable doubt about whether the arsenic levels proved deliberate poisoning or merely reflected James's years of self-administered doses. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The most damaging testimony came from the servants who had observed Florence's behavior during James's illness. Mrs. Briggs described finding Florence alone with her husband during his worst episodes, noting that his condition seemed to deteriorate most dramatically after meals that Florence had personally prepared or supervised. The nursemaid testified about discovering the hidden flypapers and Florence's inability to provide a satisfactory explanation for their presence in her private chambers. But it was the revelation of Florence's relationship with Alfred Brearley that truly sealed her fate in the eyes of Victorian morality. The prosecution presented evidence of their London rendezvous with the horrified fascination of a society that viewed adultery as evidence of complete moral bankruptcy. In the rigid moral framework of 1889, a woman who could betray her marriage vows was certainly capable of murder, and the jury's faces reflected the shock and disgust that such revelations generated among respectable Victorian gentlemen. The defense, led by Sir Charles Russell, faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client whose behavior had violated every social convention that the jury held sacred. Russell was widely regarded as one of the finest advocates in the English-speaking world, but even his legendary skills seemed inadequate to the challenge of rehabilitating Florence's reputation in the face of such overwhelming prejudice. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the 12 men of the jury filed back into their seats after deliberating for 38 minutes, a scandalously brief period that spoke volumes about their certainty regarding Florence Maybrick's guilt. The speed of their decision stunned even the most pessimistic observers, who had expected hours of careful consideration given the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence. Instead, the jurors had apparently found the case so clear-cut that extended discussion was unnecessary, a conclusion that would haunt the pursuit of justice for decades to come. Florence rose to face the verdict with a composure that observers would later debate as evidence of either remarkable courage or callous indifference. Her black dress seemed to absorb the gaslight that illuminated the courtroom, creating an almost spectral appearance that added to the drama of the moment. The packed galleries held their collective breath as the foreman, a prosperous Liverpool merchant whose stern expression revealed nothing of the deliberations that had just concluded, prepared to deliver the judgment that would determine whether Florence lived or died. Guilty. The single word rang through St. George's Hall with the finality of a death knell, followed immediately by an eruption of voices from the galleries that Justice Stephen had to silence with his gavel. The sound seemed to reverberate endlessly through the vast space, each echo carrying with it the weight of Victorian moral certainty and the collective judgment of a society that had already decided Florence's fate long before the jury's deliberation began. Florence received the verdict with a slight trembling of her hands that she quickly suppressed, but otherwise maintained the dignity that had characterized her throughout the trial. When Justice Stephen asked if she had anything to say before sentence was passed, her response would be remembered as one of the most poignant moments in the annals of British legal history. Standing straight despite the weight of condemnation that pressed down upon her, she spoke in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. "My lord, everything has been against me. I wish to say that although the evidence has been circumstantial, I am not guilty of this crime." The simple dignity of her words, delivered without theatrical emotion or desperate pleading, created a moment of unexpected sympathy even among those who had been convinced of her guilt. Several observers later noted that her statement possessed the ring of truth that had been notably absent from much of the prosecution's case. Justice Stephen's response demonstrated the harsh moral certainty of Victorian justice at its most unforgiving. Rising to his full height, the elderly judge seemed to embody the righteous anger of an empire that brooked no challenge to its moral foundations. His words, delivered in the sepulchral tones that had made him one of the most feared judicial figures of his generation, would echo through history as an example of how prejudice and moral outrage could corrupt even the highest levels of justice. "Florence Elizabeth Maybrick, you have been found guilty of the willful murder of your husband, and the evidence leads me to the conclusion that the verdict is correct. The crime of which you have been convicted is one of the most horrible that can be committed, the deliberate poisoning of your husband by a wife who should have been his comfort and support. You seem to have given way to a passion for another man, and that guilty passion became the motive for this terrible crime." The death sentence, when it came, surprised no one in the courtroom, yet its formal pronouncement still sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. "The sentence of this court upon you is that you be taken from hence to a lawful prison, and from thence to a place of execution, and that you be there hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may the Lord have mercy on your soul." The ancient formula, unchanged for centuries, seemed to transform Florence from a living woman into a historical footnote, a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral corruption and foreign influence on proper English society. The international reaction to Florence's conviction and death sentence proved as explosive as gunpowder in a flame. American newspapers, already suspicious of British justice and protective of their expatriate citizen, launched fierce campaigns questioning both the evidence and the fairness of the proceedings. The New York Times declared the trial a disgrace to British justice, while other publications accused the Liverpool court of railroading an innocent American woman to satisfy local prejudices and anti-foreign sentiment. The British press, however, largely supported the verdict with editorials that praised the jury's wisdom and Justice Stephen's moral clarity. The Times of London declared that justice has been served upon a woman whose moral corruption led inevitably to the most heinous of crimes, while provincial papers throughout England echoed similar sentiments. The case had become a symbol of the clash between American brashness and British propriety, with Florence paying the ultimate price for cultural misunderstanding and moral prejudice. Petitions for clemency began circulating within hours of the sentence, gathering thousands of signatures from both sides of the Atlantic. The case had touched something deep in the public consciousness, raising questions about justice, prejudice, and the treatment of women that went far beyond the specific circumstances of James Maybrick's death. The stone walls of Walton Prison closed around Florence Maybrick like the pages of a book snapping shut on a life that had once known luxury and social prominence. Her cell, measuring barely 8 feet by 6 feet, contained only the most basic necessities, a narrow iron bed, a wooden chair, and a small table where she would spend countless hours writing letters that pleaded for justice and clemency. The woman who had once presided over elegant dinner parties at Battlecrease House now faced each dawn knowing that the hangman's noose might await her at any moment, pending the outcome of appeals that seemed increasingly desperate with each passing day. The transformation of Florence from condemned murderer to cause célèbre began almost immediately after her sentencing. as the sheer speed and certainty of her conviction began to trouble observers who had initially supported the verdict. Legal scholars started analyzing the trial transcripts with fresh eyes, discovering procedural irregularities and evidentiary problems that had been overlooked in the rush to judgment. The most glaring issue was Justice Stevens' prejudicial charge to the jury, in which he had essentially directed them to find Florence guilty while paying lip service to the presumption of innocence. International pressure mounted with each passing week as American diplomatic officials demanded answers from their British counterparts about the treatment of a United States citizen. The American press campaign intensified, with newspapers publishing detailed analyses of the evidence that revealed the circumstantial nature of much of the prosecution's case. Editorial writers pointed out that no one had actually witnessed Florence administering poison to her husband, that the medical evidence was ambiguous at best, and that the entire case rested on speculation about her character rather than concrete proof of criminal action. The breakthrough that would ultimately save Florence's life came from an unexpected source: a detailed review of James Maybrick's medical history and his documented habit of consuming arsenic and other poisons as supposed health tonics. Medical experts who examined this evidence independently began questioning whether James had actually died from deliberate poisoning or from the cumulative effects of years of self-medication. Dr. Thomas Stevenson, one of England's foremost toxicologists, published a detailed analysis suggesting that the arsenic levels found in James's body were consistent with his habitual consumption rather than indicating a massive poisoning dose. This medical revelation coincided with growing public unease about the role that Florence's adultery had played in securing her conviction. Progressive voices in both Britain and America began arguing that moral disapproval of her affair with Alfred Brearley had prejudiced the jury against her, creating a situation where she was essentially being executed for adultery rather than murder. Women's rights advocates seized on the case as an example of how Victorian society's double standards placed women at a severe disadvantage in the legal system. The pressure for clemency reached its peak in August 1889, when a petition bearing over 100,000 signatures was presented to Queen Victoria herself. The petition, organized by prominent Americans and British liberals, argued that Florence had been the victim of prejudicial treatment and circumstantial evidence that would never have convicted a man under similar circumstances. The international dimension of the controversy was impossible to ignore, as American officials made it clear that Florence's execution would seriously damage Anglo-American relations at a time when both nations valued their growing partnership. Home Secretary Henry Matthews found himself caught between competing pressures as he reviewed Florence's case for possible commutation. The evidence supporting her guilt remained troubling but not conclusive, while the irregularities in her trial and the international outcry created compelling reasons for mercy. After weeks of careful consideration and consultation with legal experts, Matthews made a decision that would satisfy no one completely, but perhaps serve the interests of justice better than the original sentence. On August 22, 1889, just 3 days before Florence's scheduled execution, her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, a decision that sparked both relief and outrage depending on one's perspective. Supporters of the commutation saw it as a recognition that serious doubts existed about her guilt, while her critics viewed it as a capitulation to foreign pressure that undermined British justice. Florence herself received the news with characteristic composure, expressing gratitude for the reprieve while maintaining her innocence of the charges against her. The 15 years that followed transformed Florence from an international cause célèbre into something approaching a forgotten woman. Confined to Aylesbury prison, she maintained her dignity and her claims of innocence through a routine of reading, writing, and the occasional visit from supporters who never abandoned their belief in her innocence. She wrote extensively about her experiences, producing manuscripts that provided intimate insights into Victorian prison conditions and the psychological toll of prolonged incarceration for a crime she insisted she never committed. Throughout her imprisonment, new evidence continued to emerge that cast further doubt on her conviction. Revelations about James's extensive drug use, questions about the reliability of the arsenic testing methods used in 1889, and growing understanding of the prejudicial nature of her trial all contributed to a gradual shift in public opinion about her guilt or innocence. The morning of January 25, 1904, marked not just Florence Maybrick's release from Aylesbury prison, but the beginning of a quest for historical truth that would consume forensic experts, legal scholars, and amateur investigators for more than a century. As she walked through the prison gates, no longer the vibrant young woman who had entered Battlecrease House as a bride, Florence carried with her the accumulated weight of 15 years spent protesting her innocence to anyone who would listen. Her hair had turned gray, her face bore the lines of prolonged suffering, but her eyes still held the spark of defiance that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her ordeal. The world Florence emerged into was vastly different from the one she had left behind. The rigid moral certainties of Victorian society were beginning to crack under the pressure of new ideas about women's rights, scientific advancement, and social justice. The case that had once seemed so clear-cut to the jurors of 1889 now appeared increasingly problematic to observers equipped with better understanding of forensic science and criminal psychology. The question that haunted her supporters was no longer whether she might be innocent, but whether justice had ever been possible given the prejudices and limitations of her era. Modern forensic analysis, applied to the surviving evidence from Florence's case, has revealed disturbing gaps and inconsistencies that would make conviction impossible under contemporary legal standards. The arsenic testing methods used in 1889 were primitive by today's standards, prone to contamination and misinterpretation that could easily produce false positives or inflated readings. Dr. Michael Baden, one of America's most respected forensic pathologists, examined the case records in the 1990s and concluded that the medical evidence presented at trial was insufficient to prove poisoning beyond a reasonable doubt. Even more damaging to the prosecution's case was the growing understanding of James Maybrick's extensive drug consumption, which had been inadequately explored during the original investigation. Modern toxicologists have calculated that James's daily intake of arsenic, strychnine, and morphine was sufficient to cause the exact symptoms that led to his death, without requiring any additional poisoning by Florence. His habit of consuming these substances as supposed health tonics, combined with the stress of his business activities and underlying health conditions, created a perfect storm that could easily explain his death without invoking murder. The flypaper evidence, which had seemed so damning to Victorian jurors, appears far less conclusive when examined through the lens of modern forensic science. Chemical analysis has shown that extracting sufficient arsenic from flypapers to cause death would have required a sophisticated understanding of chemistry that Florence, despite her intelligence, simply did not possess. Moreover, the arsenic solution that could be extracted using the primitive methods available to her would have been too weak to cause rapid death and too bitter to administer without detection. Perhaps most significantly, modern psychological analysis of Florence's behavior during James's illness reveals patterns consistent with an innocent woman under extreme stress rather than a calculating murderer. Her purchases at the chemist shop, her nervous demeanor, and her seemingly contradictory statements all align with the behavior of someone desperately trying to help a dying husband while facing suspicion and hostility from those around her. The composed demeanor that Victorian observers interpreted as evidence of guilt appears, under modern psychological understanding, to be a normal response to trauma and overwhelming circumstances. The discovery of James Maybrick's diary in the 1990s, a document claiming to reveal him as Jack the Ripper, added another bizarre twist to an already complex case, though most experts now consider this diary to be a modern forgery. However, the controversy surrounding the diary led to renewed examination of all the evidence in Florence's case, resulting in virtual unanimity among contemporary legal experts that her conviction was a miscarriage of justice of staggering proportions. What emerges from this modern re-examination is not just the story of one woman's struggle against prejudice and primitive forensic science, but a broader indictment of how cultural bias and moral panic can corrupt even the most supposedly civilized legal systems. Florence was convicted not because the evidence proved her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but because Victorian society needed a scapegoat for their discomfort with changing gender roles, international marriages, and the challenge that her American independence posed to traditional British values. The final irony of Florence Maybrick's story is that she lived to see her vindication but died too early to witness its full flowering. She passed away in 1941 in Connecticut, still maintaining her innocence, but largely forgotten by a world consumed with more pressing concerns. It would take several more decades before the full scope of the injustice she suffered would be recognized by legal historians and forensic experts. Today, the consensus among objective observers is overwhelming. Florence Elizabeth Maybrick was almost certainly innocent of murdering her husband, the victim of a perfect storm of circumstantial evidence, cultural prejudice, and primitive forensic science. Her case stands as a testament to the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of maintaining high standards of evidence in criminal proceedings, regardless of public pressure or moral outrage. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.